It is my pleasure to welcome Sinan Ülgen, my usual sparring partner on Turkey. Everybody knows him, I guess. He's a visiting scholar here at Carnegie Europe and also runs his own think tank, EDAM, in Istanbul. And we have the pleasure to host Alex Barker, FT Bureau Chief, therefore somebody uniquely placed to explain to us the logics of the Tories' politics and 2 elections in 2 votes in 1 year, and then hard and soft Brexit and so on. But of course, we'll first expect you to react to Sinan's paper and then perhaps give us a bit more. You know that Sinan has produced this paper. We have very nice people at Carnegie. We even accept our scholars to publish with the competition, that is Brookings. And as always with Sinan, it's a very thoroughly documented paper constructing a theory that, given the respective situations in the UK and in Turkey, there is now a case for, or an opportunity for a common agenda between Turkey and the UK. Because, of course, within the Brexit negotiation, there will be some sort of arrangement, customs union or otherwise, and because Turkey has a customs union. Turkey is the only country in the world that has a customs union with the EU, and this is due for negotiation for modernization, probably starting at the end of this year or beginning of next year. And therefore, it, in theory at least, creates an opportunity for the 2 countries to join forces. This is impeccably argumented by Sinan, perhaps at the risk of defying political cynicism on both sides, but we will see. As our tradition is, Sinan will first introduce his paper, and then Alex will comment, and then I'll have a couple of questions to them, and then we'll continue with a discussion. Sinan, up to you.
Thank you, Mark. And welcome to you all. It's really a big pleasure to see many friends here in the room. The reason why I drafted this paper was essentially predicated on the assumption that Turkey's relationship with the EU is broken. The ultimate objective of membership, which has for a very long time been the basis of this relationship, is no more realistic, at least for the foreseeable future. And therefore, there has been an effort, really, for some, these efforts are construed as building an alternative narrative to the Turkey-EU relationship. For others like me, as an effort to complement the accession track, but nonetheless, there has been an effort to see whether we can engineer a more collaborative framework between Turkey and the EU outside of the accession track. And that's really been, you know, where we look at issues like the refugee deal, the modernization of the customs union, energy dialogue, foreign policy cooperation, counterterrorism. So there are a number of areas out there that don't fall into the accession track, but nonetheless are part of the Turkey-EU framework. For the UK, the situation is obviously very different, but convergent, in the sense that the UK is exiting, and therefore it is in search of structuring the future of its relationship with the EU. We don't know what format that will take. That's, you know, we shall know more probably, you know, within 24 months. But nonetheless, that's what's at the table. The UK is trying to structure its relationship with Europe, and Turkey is trying to structure its relationship with Europe. So therefore, the question is, given that these are two countries geographically at the periphery of Europe that have a very historic, deep connection to Europe, the UK being a EU member until now, could they foster a common European agenda, and what that agenda would look like? So that is the ultimate question which I've tried to address in this paper that I published for the competition, to borrow Mark's terminology. Now, my first presentation was in London the day that Theresa May announced that she was going for general elections. So I had another colleague of Alex, Dan Dombey, who's the Brexit editor of the FT, to launch this paper over there. And there were many FCO people in the room. They said, okay, this is a great idea, all of that, but we are now fixated on a hard Brexit. So all these things about trade policy and so on, it makes immense sense, perhaps economically, but politically, they're not feasible under the current circumstances. Well, what do you know? You know, fast forward a few weeks and a general election, and now the political environment seems to have changed quite radically in the UK, at least in terms of how they're looking at the Brexit negotiations. There are still ongoing negotiations about the new government. We still don't know what the conditions of the Irish party shall be. But their traditional position has been that, you know, the UK should remain in the customs union. So we'll see how the internal negotiations in the UK will evolve. But nonetheless, what we can say is that today it's a very different situation than I first launched this paper in London. So I will focus on two main areas, more on the first one than the second one, and these are trade and security policy. On trade, there is a Turkey experience that the UK could possibly profit from, and that's, as Mark said, that's the customs union arrangement. That has been on the agenda of the UK until May declared that her option would now be to conclude a bold and comprehensive FTA with the EU. But that position may indeed be revisited. And if it gets revisited, I think there is quite a bit of insights that Turkey's relationship with the EU on the trade dimension could bring to the Brexit debate. Very shortly, Turkey's experience with the customs union has by and large been, you know, very positive experience, economically speaking. So there are a number of studies over the years, and one, you know, the Commission as well as published one last year, demonstrating the positive economic impact of the customs union. That is not to say that structurally there has been a number of difficulties in this relationship. Inherent in the arrangement that the country binds itself to the EU in trade policy matters, while not being a EU member and or while being a very long-term EU member. So the difficulties have essentially been that there's been a asymmetry in trade policies where Turkey is a policy follower that has created a degree of trade difficulties because of having to follow the EU's trade policy. Secondly, there are also aspects to this agreement, primarily dispute settlement, that has remained dysfunctional, and that's also created over time what we call, you know, an accumulation of trade irritants that has bedeviled the relationship. So that's also something that needs to be tackled. But nonetheless, overall, it's been a positive experience. Now, the UK's perspective on this, however, even though, you know, I think there's quite a bit of material here that can be taken on board, there is one very important difference from the UK. And the UK, from the UK's perspective, the UK, if it does either remain in the customs union or does this bold and comprehensive trade agreement, it is not starting from scratch. So it's very different when a third country decides to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU. Then the UK seeking a new trade arrangement with the EU that will essentially unravel the economic integration of the single market and even the economic integration of the customs union. These are two very different propositions. So from the UK's perspective, this I didn't really get a sense, even when I was in London, that there's enough appreciation of what this unraveling means. The unraveling essentially means, in economic terms, that while you were trading on the basis of free movement of goods, you shall be trading on the principle of rules of origin. And that has, quite significant repercussions for the supply chains of manufacturers. And we hear this, from the global automotive manufacturers who want the UK to stay with in the customs union. It is going to have also an incidence about how an attractive place the UK can remain for future investments in manufacturing, given this issue about rules of origin. It has an impact on how the UK will negotiate its status in WTO, because if its trade preference regime will change, that will change. And finally, even to get to this point of having a bold and comprehensive trade agreement, to the extent that this will be seen as a mixed competence agreement, the UK may very well end up in a position like Canada a few months ago, where a subnational parliament can take hostage the trade negotiations, because they are in mixed agreements. You will end up in a situation where not only EU institutions, but national member states will also have to ratify the trade agreements. So these are all these areas which the UK negotiators will have to take into consideration as they're looking at how to restructure the trade relationship in the future with the EU. And that's also a reason why there is quite a bit of arguments to be made why we can talk possibly about a common Turkey-EU agenda on trade vis-à-vis the EU. Now, what form that agenda can take, there's a multitude of options. We can, at one extreme, we can talk about exploring the feasibility of a tripartite customs union, Turkey, UK, EU. At a lower level of ambitions, there's at least a case to be made for a regular UK-Turkey consultations on trade as they are negotiating the future of their trade regime with the EU. And finally, also to try to devise some common positions that they could try to negotiate, possibly collectively, if that fails bilaterally with the EU. And finally, on a note on trade, is that even in the UK establishment decides that the future is not the customs union. There is a case to be made that a transitional arrangement that may take 6-7 years until this bold and comprehensive free trade agreement enters into force will be the customs union. So in that sense, there is, even when you look at the politics of these negotiations, you can argue that, the customs union option will remain on the agenda of the Brexit negotiators. One important opportunity, again, as Mark has mentioned, is that now Turkey is entering, probably towards the end of the year, a new phase of its negotiations with the EU, with the Commission expecting a mandate from the Council to start these negotiations on the modernization of the customs union, which will provide room to address some of these drawbacks and deficiencies that I've tried to outline. And this has relevance for the UK as well, because even if the UK remains in the customs union regime as a transitional arrangement, I think London would have an interest in trying to improve the implications of that regime for that time period. So that's one big area where the Turkey-UK strategic partnership or collaboration makes sense. The other big area, and I'll be shorter here, is on security and defense policy. The reason why this is also quite a substantive area is that as the UK, Brexit means that the UK will be exactly in the same status as Turkey regarding security and defense policy as a non-EU NATO country. And it will suddenly find itself exposed to all the problems that Turkey has had when it's trying to link to European security and defense policy and to common security and defense policy. What are those problems? Very briefly, Turkey is a NATO member, so it sees NATO as the main pillar of its external security architecture, but nonetheless recognizes the role that the EU can play in the security field with a expanding CSDP. So Turkey tried to be a partner to CSDP over the years. It has participated in a number of different CSDP missions, but many of the frustrations that were built over the years have not been really overcome. These frustrations stem from the fact that even though CSDP allows the participation of third countries in its missions, it retains the decision-making priority, which you may find sensible, within EU structures. And the EU has been very reluctant to open up to those structures in this area of CSDP, whether it has to do with Committee of Contributors, whether it has to do with the operational planning and so on, to third countries that eventually end up participating in CSDP missions. And that's really been a fundamental problem to which no solution has been found. And all the operational and even political difficulties generated by this lack of institutional flexibility in CSDP third countries relationship will be exactly the type of difficulties that the UK will face once it exits the EU. So therefore, there is also quite an interesting agenda between Turkey and the EU and the UK that can be pursued on the CSDP theme. There, the idea would be to try to convince the EU to restructure the modalities of third countries' participation in CSDP missions, which is essentially a framework participation agreement. So how to turn this into a more flexible mechanism, how to allow an earlier participation, more voice and in these operations. Another area that might be of common interest is to propose a Berlin Plus in reverse. Berlin Plus is the agreement between EU and NATO that allows EU to use NATO assets. There can be a case to be made that we may want to think about the Berlin Plus in reverse, where NATO can use EU assets, especially in crisis management operations. So there are a number of examples there. Finally, about the politics of all of this. How feasible is this? Well, I've argued that there is ample evidence to push for an agenda of, I wouldn't say collusion, that's a bad word, but consultation, cooperation, close coordination between Turkey and the UK on their European future. I've gave you two examples, trade and security policy, but we can essentially extrapolate this to all other external policies of the EU that come under an institutional mantle. So if, for instance, we end up with an external energy policy that's institutionalized, I can make the same argument for energy policy. The caveat, finally, what is the caveat in all of this? The caveat is whether, under the current political environment in Turkey, whether the UK's political establishment will find enough interest and will find it politically feasible to be in such a close consultation with Ankara. So the democratic backtracking that we have witnessed in Turkey, especially after 2011, whether that in itself will be a serious hindrance to this type of positive agenda that I'm trying to champion here. And I'll end it here.
Thank you, Sinan. A lot of food for thought. Before we discuss this, Alex, as the bureau chief of the Financial Times here, you're uniquely placed to judge all this. You also have your own personal background on Turkey, and your editor in Brussels was the FT correspondent, in London, sorry, was the FT correspondent in Istanbul for a long time. So you both have a Turkish angle to this.
Well, indeed, I in terms of background, I'm Anglo-Turkish, and as an Anglo-Turkish journalist covering the EU, it's been quite a tumultuous couple of years, I have to say. And first of all, I should just say what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with two wise men that I'm often calling on the phone for insights when writing on these areas. So, and particularly with Sinan, who is as the rare experience of actually having negotiated a customs union with the EU, and if London haven't been asking you about what that involves, then they should have been, I guess. And I mean, from your very clearly argued paper, I would first of all just like to step back a bit and try to draw out what it tells us about Europe and its neighbours. And clearly, from Iceland through Norway, through the east to Turkey, Switzerland, the basis on which the Union has been engaging with these countries is looking increasingly uneasy, uncomfortable, and disordered to an extent. That often is the case with big economic powers. But what we're seeing with Brexit and with the political situation in Turkey is a crystallization of some of the dilemmas and issues that we see in the neighborhood. Obviously, enlargement, membership was the magnet and the focus of external relations for decades. That has stalled, and with it we see a periphery of kind of misfit arrangements. And the question now is whether the change we're seeing from Brexit in Turkey is enough of an impetus to bring more kind of rational order to some of those external arrangements and put them on a different basis. The biggest, most ambitious view of that, I guess, is some kind of third ring around the Eurozone, the non-Euro members, and then that third tier, which is based on has a looser political but deeper economic relationship potentially, and is open with clearer precedents for members from quite different political perspectives, backgrounds, and directions. And Sinan's second valuable insight from someone covering Brexit is just that glimpse into the future for the UK, if it were, as now is quite possible, look to that customs union arrangement for either an extended transition or as a kind of end state. And first of all, it's that asymmetry in decision making, and how for Turkey that has proved rewarding enough that the political kind of issues and grievances that raises are secondary. For the UK, having been a member of this union, sitting in the TPC, the trade committees, shaping policy to a degree, to step out of that, to give up control of your external tariff policy, on goods at least, is psychologically going to be a huge, huge shock. And similarly, it reminds us of the third country dimension to Brexit, which is often overlooked to a degree. But the UK, I mean, the EU arrangements that the UK currently benefits from are all going to lapse to a degree once we leave the Union, even if we stay in the customs union in some circumstances. And those will have to be remade. And remade with, to some extent, their hands behind, tied together in negotiations if they remain within the customs union and don't have the ability to bargain with goods tariffs. They still have to do all those deals, but they have less leverage in being able to do them. That is, again, another consideration where the closer they come to this decision, I think will loom large, and I think was one of the main reasons why, before the election, customs union was kind of ruled out so clear, well, not so clearly, but ruled out to a degree. The second point is the complexity of this and how multi-layered that relationship is. We sometimes talk very easily of staying inside the customs union and outside, but actually the truth is Britain will leave the European Customs Union and will have to negotiate a new arrangement afterwards that can be, as Turkey's finding, of various levels of debt. If you go to the Turkish border with Bulgaria, it's easy to see that customs unions are not frictionless. There is a queue of 7 to 8 kilometres, 15 kilometres sometimes, because transport permits are rationed. And the Austrians are particularly keen on rationing them. And so every lorry that goes through needs a different piece of documentation to come through. That is not a seamless customs union. And Britain, in negotiating any future lasting arrangement on a customs union, will have to filter all these different layers that make up the free movement of goods. Now, in terms of whether this is practical, that's where, in terms of the Turkish-British cooperation, there are clearly a convergence of interests on various points. At the same time, I have to question the practicality of this in this political environment. First and foremost, which Sinan mentioned, is the political situation in Turkey. We're seeing, even today, with the Commission has proposed a mandate for itself to negotiate better terms for the customs union with Turkey, and there's already clear divisions within the member states over whether this is a good idea to pursue, and that comes down to politics, to human rights, to the question of whether, in this very difficult relationship with President Erdogan at the moment, whether this is the right manner to go about trying to stabilize things. And secondly, where Turkey does have some absolutely legitimate grievances over the kind of trade irritants, its lack of influence or even information about what's going on around the trade policy that's opening up its markets. To resolve this crosses one of the brightest red lines that the EU has, which is autonomy. You can have different levels of kind of consultation, but actually getting to a point where you're having a concrete influence on how the EU is making its trade policy, I find very hard to see. And that goes for the UK as well, in terms of the partnership that we hear a lot about, the special partnership. The EU, in 5 to 10 years' time, are going to find it very difficult to agree arrangements that would give Britain influence over rulemaking in a trade agreement or in how a customs union is conducted, exercises its trade policy. Because fundamentally they had, 13% share or whatever the weighted vote is as an EU member, and any arrangement that is between the EU and UK, it's quite hard to replicate that in a way where they have less influence but some influence. And you can see how uncomfortable the EU is with arrangements with Switzerland at the moment for that reason, because while they're very complex, most of these arrangements do is freeze the acquis at a point and give Switzerland the right to say, well, you know, we're not very happy with the evolution of policy and we want to kind of keep it there. And the EU is unhappy with that. It wants an institutional architecture which ensures consistency of application and allows the evolution of EU law over time. Now, some problems are big and difficult enough that the only way to solve them is to make them even bigger. And I guess you could make that argument in terms of Turkey and the UK at the moment and its relations with the Union. But three questions around this. I mean, first of all, what interest does the UK have in combining forces with Turkey? I can see this being possible in the medium-long term once arrangements have settled to some degree with the EU. But to see that happening now, I really struggle with, not just because of the political situation in Turkey, but in terms of whether that actually brings them any more leverage in their negotiations with the EU. And it goes back to some of the weaknesses of being in a customs union, I guess. You know, when the UK is negotiating a trade arrangement with the EU, they know that they would have goods access to the Turkish market in any event. And so the incentive to join with Turkey and bring in the baggage of Turkey's political issues at the moment may not be as clear-cut as you would think. And the second point is that while there are obviously crossovers of interest on areas like enforcement and how the existing arrangements with Turkey's customs union have basically been obsolete because unworkable, and how the Brexit and Turkey model could potentially have a single kind of, not a single solution, but at least a model that could work for both. It masks huge differences in the perspectives of these two countries. The EU's issue with Turkey is mainly over trust, rule of law, and the convergence of law over time. With the UK, the issue is less trust as the divergence of law over time and the influence that the UK would be looking to have over that. And they're very different questions that would probably require different responses. And certainly, and this is my final point, the EU will want to take very different approaches to these things. And it would be extremely reluctant to put these in negotiating terms into the same basket. It wants issues coming out of Brexit and Turkey's political situation contained and managed in separate ways, and they would not take well to a joining of forces, I don't think. But those are my brief remarks on a very
Okay. Well, we're going to follow up on this. Sinan, let's go back to the basic component, which is the Turkish-EU customs union modernization. As you explained, this has been long in coming, but very beneficial for Turkey and the EU. Turkey's industry has been uplifted to global standards. The EU has created a competitive production base in Turkey, and more importantly, at least when you visit, as I did when I was the ambassador there, several times, automotive factories, you see that Turkey is fully integrated in the EU from that point of view. Now, there are flows in the customs union, especially the free trade agreement aspect, and the fact that services and agriculture are not covered, but that might be one of the most promising avenues between the EU and Turkey in the short term. We all know that. There'll be technical conditionality linked to the level playing field that relates to competition policy, to trade unions, to public procurement. There is the road transport issue, and there might be, as we will see probably in the European Parliament this morning, some political conditionality linked to human rights. How do you see all this conditionality playing out in the strictly EU-Turkey track here on the customs union modernization?
Yes, along with Cyprus, that's the biggest impediment to the start of the negotiations. There seems to be a split within the EU about how conditionality heavy the mandate should be. There are countries that claim that there should be, heavy conditionality imposed from the beginning. That's also the view of the European Parliament. There are others who believe that the technical conditionality embodied in this revitalized customs union should be enough. And at the end of the day, in any case, it is going to be the European Parliament will get to have its say at the end, and therefore it's going to be politicized at the end. So that seems to be the split. I think looking at Ankara, my sense is that having a too heavy political conditionality from the start would be tantamount to failure. It makes much more sense not to totally lift the conditionality, but to backload it, not to front-load it, so that over time we build not only trust, but we also build an understanding how this can be beneficial for both parties, so that the political conditionalities can become then more acceptable at the end. But asking that heavy dose of political conditionality at the beginning, which is the threat that we're facing today, would be, in my assessment, a recipe for failure.
Okay, thank you. Alex, you already touched upon that. The issue of whether there is in the political environment in the UK now any space, any interest, any visibility for an idea of joining forces with Turkey on a customs union. That is bound to be difficult. At the same time, what we see is that there is a very strong bilateral economic activity between the UK and Turkey. You have HSBC, Vodafone, BP, everybody is there. And then we have these discussions on defense industry, aerospace, and so on. So isn't it the case that, at least for the time being, and given the very difficult political environment in the UK, London would choose to develop its bilateral relationship with Turkey without interfering at economic level, without interfering on both the difficult political relationship between the EU and Turkey in general and the Brexit negotiation?
Yes, and I've covered 3 prime ministers who have always put the kind of economic political interests in this relationship over and above concerns they may have had about Turkey's policies in any areas, or indeed the kind of direction of the government on the democratic issues we see very clearly at the moment. That, I think, is only going to be reinforced after Brexit. Already in council groups discussing Turkey's accession process, you've seen Boris Johnson, another Anglo-Turk out there, quite vocal in supporting Turkey's position, which doesn't sit particularly well with how he argued the referendum campaign. But that's how
the
it
least
is.
you can say.
That's indeed. But there clearly is an incentive for, well, the constraints on them from being an EU member have been reduced. The incentives for them to really try and make headway in post-Brexit economic kind of relationships with countries like Turkey are huge. The necessity of it is there, regardless of what happens in terms of the customs union. Those existing arrangements that the EU has with Turkey will lapse. It's got to be renegotiated. So it is, in that sense, a moment of opportunity, and I think the politics is there as well.
Okay.
But one caveat:
yeah.
When Theresa May was there and seemed very positive on President Erdogan, there was some kickback in the UK, and that's hard to predict how that moves in the future, and a lot will depend on what happens in Turkey.
Yep. Thank you. At this point, and before moving to questions, I'd like to bring in somebody who must be in the room, but I don't see. Pierre Vimont. Pierre, are you there? Pierre. The reason why I would like to bring Pierre in is that Pierre, 5 days ago, published an article called Bringing Brexit Back to Reality, where he argues that the divorce is irreversible, but that for the negotiation to move forward in a constructive manner, the interlocutors would have to shed their most controversial narratives and focus on real issues. Pierre, could you say a few words about your article, if you have a microphone? You do. My God, technology works here.
I'm not sure. Yeah, it works. It works. But I don't want to interfere with what is today Sinan's day. And having read Sinan's paper this morning in the plane traveling back from Lisboa, I find this a very good piece. And I would just like to add two comments. One is that, of course, and coming back to the question you raised to me, Mark, is that, of course, we're starting from different points of view, Sinan and myself. I take for granted that the red lines of the Prime Minister are here to stay, at least for a while, and maybe reason will prevail at some point, I guess, under the pressure of the business community, but later on, when the Article 50 negotiation will have traveled already a long way. And that, as Sinan is underlining time and again in his paper, the inconveniences, the shortcomings of no custom union, no deal at all if necessary, no deal rather than a bad deal, no transition, no European Court of Justice, so on and so forth, don't stand up at some point. So my point is to say, let's try to see how we can make these negotiations as comfortable and friendly as possible, taking for granted that for the time being we have to live with those red lines. Sinan takes a different point of view, and I very much can go along with what he's saying. My only concern, but I detect that Sinan himself doesn't believe too much in this idea that Article 50 negotiation could become some sort of trilateral negotiations. It's more about bilateral consultation between Britain and Turkey, and I think he's absolutely right, because I think from the Turkish point of view, what looks already like a very difficult negotiation on customs union would even be more difficult if we added in the basket of the Turkish delegation the three priorities on the Brexit divorce: citizens' right, financial bill, the Irish border. That would make it an impossible task. So I think the Article 50 is already going to be very messy, and I think we should leave it that way. That at the end of the day, just as the UK delegation will discover that their red lines are very difficult to stand up, but then it would be for British politics to find a way out of this, and I leave it to them. I think as we move along, we will see that there is a sort of common agenda for Britain and Turkey and maybe many other third countries in terms of this circle of friends, this third circle we hear more about. So on this, I can go along and I have no problem. My second point, and there it would be a question to Sinan, and I'm sorry for being too long. It's when you hit at the end of the day, at the end of your article, about the strategic partnership between Britain and Turkey, which I think is quite true. But what would this strategic partnership stand for? You will have two countries there which are somewhat at a loss to find the kind of alliance they want to have in this great global international world. Geopolitics today means that you can't rely anymore on Trump as a friend. If both decide that they want to stay out of the European Union and find their own way of accommodate their own relationship with Europe, where will they find themselves at the end? And will the two of them be enough to strike some sort of alliance that will have enough leverage in geopoliticals tomorrow between the United States, Turkey, United States, Russia, China, and others? How does an Anglo-Turkish strategic partnership fit? And at the end, and I'm coming back to what you were saying at the moment, won't they both feel the need to come closer to the EU, which after all is maybe their best friend at the end of the day, and one with which they should stick together and try to find a closer relationship? Sorry for being so long.
No, thank you, Pierre. And for those who may have missed it, the article by Pierre was June 15. It's of course on our website. Now, questions. I'll take 3 questions to start with. Michele Villani, over there. No.
Thank you.
Stand up.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on the appealing concept of triangle partnership or relationship, which is all the more appealing after the British elections and the possibility that the UK remains connected through the customs union with the EU. I'd like to share 3 thoughts. One on the positive side and 2 on the negative side of the EU-Turkey relations and EU-UK relations and the possible link between the UK and Turkey in terms of consultations or whatever. I would say the negative, or at least let me start with the positive implications of this triangular relationship could be that as UK withdraws from the EU while remaining in the customs union, and by the way, I open and close a parenthesis, this is interesting for the UK for the reasons that you listed, but also because it spares the UK to negotiate a plethora of third country of agreement or FTAs with third countries by remaining connected to the customs union. Otherwise it would be a real headache for the UK to renegotiate what the EU has in terms of FTA with third countries, and one with Turkey as well. So on the positive side, I see, and I would like to have your opinion, the fact that as the UK withdraws from the EU while remaining plugged into the customs union, it still has a record of, a very high record of rule of law, business, favorable business, investment climate, and so on. And this could be a model for Turkey to mirror, to look at the moment it tries to clutch into the modernized customs union with the EU through negotiations that we hope will start by the end of the year. So a model, I would say a role model for Turkey in terms of business environment, investment environment, and clearly a rule of law, human rights record. That's on the positive side of this triangular relationship. As far as possible drawbacks are concerned, a conflict of interest seems to me to exist. At the moment where the UK is at the moment where Turkey is negotiating a modernized customs union, and the UK sitting in the council groups, therefore, knowing the internal EU positions which is being negotiated with Turkey, while at the same time having negotiation or consultations directly with Turkey. So this seems to be a clear conflict of interest if negotiation between EU and Turkey go on and while at the same time the UK has consultations with Turkey on whatever triangular scheme we might think of. So I see a clear conflict of interest. On the downside as well, I think there is clearly a problem, a structural problem, which is linked to the fact that UK, insofar as it remains connected to the customs union, and this is also concerning the four liberties. In other words, yes, part of the customs union, but also most likely sharing the four freedoms, continue to pursue the four freedoms, and they cannot be three, they cannot be two, they need to be four, and that's clearly the EU negotiating position. So you have a customs union linking UK and the EU with linked with the four freedoms. Now, in the Turkey case, you can forget about the four freedoms. We can hope to have an improved, modernized, upgraded customs union, which will be possibly up to scratch on one liberty, free movement of goods, perhaps partially on the second liberty, free movement of capitals, but I don't see free movement of the other two liberties, free movement of services, full free movement of services, and full free movement of persons. Although the one on services is part of the customs union mandate, so we might have bits and pieces of this. So I see few similarities in this structural, from this structural angle, and I see a clear conflict of interest in terms of the UK participating to both exercises, while I see a positive spin-off effect in terms of role model for the UK, in terms of rule of law, in terms of business, investment environment for Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you,
congratulations, and congratulations for the article. I'm sorry for being long, Mark and Sinan.
I expected that.
All right. You know me too well.
You know him
We
from
have
before,
room
right?
for other people.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi. My question is about the Cyprus problem, which has been an intractable frozen conflict since the 60s, and I think there can be a future for the UK and for Turkey and also for Greece for maybe another new partnership or another negotiation talks. And as the talks has been resumed last year, well, broken last year, resumed this year, and broken again last month, a few weeks ago, by the UN advisor, what is foreseen now? What can be the future of the negotiation talks, and how much the UK can put work on this as a guarantor, as one of the guarantor countries, and also on the energy side, as Cyprus has been, well, they've been discovering these energies around the island. Should there be a partnership, or should there be a resettlement between the two parts, between the north and south, for to benefit from the energies, or can it be can this continue like this, and the energies can it be like sold to other countries, or yeah, what is?
Okay, thank you. Third question.
Hello, this is Burak Erdin from the Permanent Representation of Turkey to the EU. Well, I have just a quick comment. I do support the idea that, Brexit will bring ample opportunities for Turkey and the UK, for sure, especially on trade issues, investment areas, and defense and security policies, because this non-EU NATO member is a different story, so the UK will be experiencing it as well. But we will be diverging on a matter. Turkey is still an acceding candidate country, and we still believe, at least the position of Turkey, is that the accession should be the main principle, framework for our relationship in the future. We know that we have problems right now, but this is the only way to keep the EU's conditionality in Turkish reform process, and also to keep Turkish people on board for the EU process, because the motivation has been declining every day, day by day. We still couldn't make this visa liberalization happen. There are other matters ongoing, but that's even, in fact, it shows that why the accession process is important for the relations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sinan.
Yes.
Three questions and comments.
Comments. Let me start with the sad story, Cyprus. It seems that the negotiators are closest as ever to a settlement. But it's just not going to be enough. Throughout this history of the frozen conflict, there have been many attempts at finding a solution. They've reached the closest point now to a solution. But, I mean, in my personal belief, it's not going to happen. Essentially because there is no overlap, seemingly, between what Turkey is ready to accept in terms of the modernization of the guarantee clause and what Anastasiades is ready to accept to take to a referendum in Cyprus. There is no overlap. And that's going to be fundamentally the point that will break the talks. There's a last effort next week in Geneva, or two, yeah. So we'll see the outcome, but unfortunately it's difficult to be optimistic. On the future of the Turkey-UK partnership in this changing world, the geopolitics of it, I think it is, first of all, we have history where, you know, the partnership between the Ottomans and the Perfied Albion has been, you know, quite a robust historical background. But certainly moving beyond that, I think they are rediscovering, or there is indeed today a search for the type of geopolitical role that both Ankara and London can play if Turkey is not going to become an EU member, and if the UK is indeed leaving the EU. So I think there, the potential of having these two NATO partners become more strategically tied to each other makes geopolitical sense. What does that mean in practice remains to be defined. I think the thinking has not matured to that level yet. But what I see in London, and this is not just about Turkey, but is really an effort to seek to redress, to solidify the UK's partners outside of Europe. And in an environment where the UK cannot reliably construe or cannot rely on the future of a sane and robust relationship with the US with a Trump administration, this inclination to seek to cement, diversify, and strengthen partnership outside of Europe will become more and more urgent for the UK. And I think Turkey has a role to play in that strategy. That's how I would frame it, really. Michele, conflict of interest. Okay, conflict of interest. So what? Would be my response. Because in the sense that if the UK will decide to remain in the customs union, you can ethically, surely, want the UK to remain very distant to Turkey. But at the same time, realpolitik would push the UK to develop an interest in what Turkey is negotiating as it's part of a modernized customs union with the EU. So in that sense, it's the realpolitik situation that will push the UK in that direction. Now, what sort of Chinese walls you can engineer to sort of overcome this conflict of interest is perhaps a different debate. But asking the UK to remain totally aloof to a negotiation that might end up affecting its own future in terms of its trade relationship with the EU, whether as a permanent arrangement or whether there's an end state, is just a too difficult proposition, I believe. And diplomacy has a way to sort of square the impossible occasionally. Yes, those would be.
Alex,
On
whatever
I'll
aspect.
start reverse order from Sinan. The conflict of interest issue, I largely agree with Sinan. I think particularly if you're looking at this time period, the main issues in this negotiation are political. I don't think it's a matter of, technical kind of insight that they would not have outside the room. It's a political negotiation, and for that reason, it's of secondary import. Another point that I'd pick up on that you made that has bothered me for a long time, and I've not really come to found an answer to this, but you suggested that Britain staying inside the customs union would help in terms of managing its third country relations. And these are the FTAs, and I mean hundreds of agreements actually that the EU has reached with third countries that would lapse at the point of Brexit. I'm not actually sure it does, because to remain in the customs union alone, all those agreements would still lapse, and it would mean that actually the UK just has a more difficult time in renegotiating them. For a transition, you'd need to, I think under WTO law, make the argument that you're a customs territory, and that's a regulatory question as well, and would look more like a kind of continuation of the single market. For a transition at least. That's quite hard to do, but it does raise this point that the third country agreements is kind of greatly neglected in this negotiation and is going to be a hugely important factor for the UK as it manages this exit. Cyprus, I'm not sure I can add much more to Sinan apart from the UK perspective. I think they're clearly very keen on trying to help as much as possible in terms of a deal, in terms of giving up land, the 99 square miles or whatever the UK that is UK sovereign territory in Cyprus at the moment. And one question I put to Sinan is whether in that calculation for Erdogan on the security guarantees, whether the EU can make any kind of parallel offer that would change their calculus on the security guarantee in terms of customs union, visas. Is there any temptation in other areas that would be enough to shift the calculus for him? And accession as a I'm torn. I think it's clearly for most member states is a moot point. I'm not sure even for public opinion in Turkey it's helping that much, because you kind of raise expectations in a way with accession that aren't being met, even on questions like visas. I mean, it's pretty amazing to me that Turkey still has no visa liberalisation, the only accession country not to have visa liberalisation. And recently we've seen that given to Ukraine for very legitimate strategic reasons, but it's a war-torn country on the periphery that's not on an accession track. And the EU has to manage these dilemmas, but I don't think it necessarily is helping to maintain that diminishing support in Turkey at the moment. But is the political pain and difficulty of transitioning into a relationship on different parameters worth it? I don't know. I change my mind quite frequently.
Thank you, Alex. We have time for another round of questions. Any volunteers?
Mark.
Yes. Yep.
Thanks, Daniel Gross from SEPS. I must say I'm a bit skeptical to see any area of common interests between the UK and Turkey. Being in a similar situation vis-à-vis the big EU doesn't mean that you have the same interests. Especially in the economic area, Turkey's interests in terms of market access are very different from those of the UK, and now talking about market access in relation to third countries. I'm therefore was thinking, can one just look at the Canada-Mexico example? There, in principle, also these two guys should have an interest in ganging up on the US, but they haven't done so, right? There hasn't been a lot of cooperation on that side. So the conclusion for me would be, from the EU point of view, I would actually be rather generous in allowing them some decision shaping, not making, influence. So I can have some trade policy committees where I have both a Turk and a Brit, and probably the two guys will neutralize each other. So in the end, we can go ahead as before. So the fact that they have these different interests should make it easier for the EU to give them some, let's say, some influence in decision shaping.
Thank you, Daniel. Karen? Another EU expert on Turkey. It works, it works.
Okay, fine.
Trust us.
Sorry, I just don't think we should let this occasion pass without asking all three of you.
All three?
Yes.
I'm not supposed to answer anything.
How attached do you think President Erdogan is to the customs union, and how far you think he's likely to make any gesture to allow the opening of modernisation talks to happen? And your own view, therefore, about how far the customs union benefits his constituency in Turkey.
Okay. So.
Thank you. I would like to look a bit in the future, taking on Sinan's earlier remark that the British position has changed a little while since the election. Before it was hard Brexit, now it seems to be a rather soft Brexit. And it still may change since Prime Minister May's situation is weakened considerably. In 2 years' time, the talks are supposed to end. But I think it's clearly for everyone following this file that after that there will be hopefully a kind of transitional period. And that will also affect, I presume, the EU or the Turkish-UK relations and the sense of coming to various agreements with UK. If you have any views on that, I would like to hear from you.
Okay. Alex, why don't you start this time?
Daniel, on the influence question, I like the idea of it neutralizing, but if you take the TTIP, if TTIP were alive, what the US would think in those circumstances, I'm not sure it would make TTIP any easier at all. The idea of opening the US market to Turkish goods would probably make it harder to achieve that deal than it was in the first place. So I mean, no, indeed, indeed. But I guess it's not a free hit to allow that kind of influence in, presumably, because you would then, I guess, be negotiating as a bloc for access. I mean, that would be the trade. I mean, Well, no, because, I mean, if TTIP had been agreed at the moment, Turkey wouldn't have had any preferential access to the US market. And I guess if you're moving to a model where you have the UK and Turkey bearing some influence on the trade policy, you would probably be negotiating as a bloc as well and ensuring access for everybody. And I guess that's a dilemma that they have to deal with. Erdogan and the customs union, I'd be interesting to hear what Sinan thinks of this. I'd quite like to put the reverse question, which is, you know, we're talking about improving the customs union after a period of incredible kind of diplomatic tension with Turkey. And it's quite remarkable to me that the question of rolling back the customs union never actually arose. I mean, given what was at stake, what we saw in the migration crisis, it's been there and banked. And for Turkey, it's hugely important for how the economy has developed and for an economy that's relatively fragile at the moment. Now, whether it's a good idea to have brought that into negotiation, I don't know, but it's clearly one of the biggest points of leverage that the EU has over Turkey, and it's not been brought into play at all. And the reverse policy has been to try and throw sweeties out to maintain a degree of leverage over a leader that is quite unpredictable for them. And I don't know how successful that can be or sustainable, really, given the political divisions there are within the union as well. Sinan.
Let me start with, Karen, your question about Erdogan and his interest in the customs union. I think, despite all the work that people here in Brussels at the Turkish mission and in Ankara have been doing, I don't get the sense that he really fully understands what the conditionalities that will be triggered by that deal. That has an impact on the political economy, and this is, so it's a fascinating question to which I don't have an answer, but I just have this frame of analysis that I wanted to share.
But even if it was accepted, do you think, would it be applied?
Well, once you have the dispute settlement mechanism brought in, then you have the ability to enforce the application, which is different from the current environment.
Okay, I know Burak wants to say something, but since Karen asked me, I'll also give my opinion on the... I think you have a very good reason from a Turkish and an EU point of view to launch these negotiations on the customs union modernization. It's simply that it has been a success for both sides, and it will be an immense regression not to do anything about it. This is at least in the manufacturing industry as of now, this is the area where Turkey is fully integrated into the EU. Turkey has legitimate complaints about free trade agreements being imposed on it without being consulted or even informed in some cases. So that can be solved. And of course, in the current customs union, and indeed in the future modernized customs union, you have a measure of conditionality which is not utterly different from the conditionality in the chapters of the accession negotiation linked to employment and social affairs, competition policy, public procurement. And as Sinan said, this will be a difficult area for Turkey to make choice. But if you consider that, as I do, and as I will document in a couple of weeks in my next article, that politically the accession negotiation is not going to go anywhere in the short and medium term unless Turkey reverses its course on rule of law, then what you have on your plate is an opportunity or a series of opportunity, and the biggest one is customs union modernization. That is not hampering the accession negotiation because, as you will see on Thursday night, or Friday, the European Council is going to say the road to accession is not closed, we're not suspending anything despite what the European Parliament might say, but Turkey is not there. Turkey doesn't meet the conditionality. So if one day Turkey wants to come back to the table, most welcome. But this is not for now. For now, we are going to concentrate on continuing to implement the immensely successful, from a humanitarian point of view, at least refugee deal. We'll do more. We'll try to implement the visa liberalization if conditions are met. And we have the customs union plus a few other things like political dialogue, energy dialogue, and so on and so forth. That is what we have on our plate. And I think that is a reason for Turkey to go that way, as difficult as it is, and it will be difficult on the EU side. Burak, you wanted to comment on the comments.
Before being posted here, I was the deputy on the state at the EU ministry, so I was somehow in the kitchen preparing the government to these negotiations.
You need a microphone so that everybody hears you.
Basically, for the last 2 years, the government has been briefed on each and every item of the modernization of the customs union, including the public procurement, competition, services, agriculture, and the main rationale is that Turkey has to somehow jump out of this middle income trap, and we need those reforms. So that was the basic rationale of Turkey starting this, at least deciding to start this process. But it seems that it is stuck here in Brussels because the negotiating mandate still hasn't been given to the Commission. So we're still waiting from Brussels to move ahead. And this Friday, the Ministry of Economy is coming to Brussels to discuss this issue. But one point to be made, it's not a unilateral negotiation. Turkey is asking for some concessions as well. The FTAs, which we haven't been part of, with the third countries the EU has been concluding with. Secondly, the decision-making process. Turkey has been out of the decision-making process. I know it's not an easy one to be resolved, but this is one thing that is asked from the Turkish side. And transit quotas, for instance, is another issue. So it's going to be a long negotiation, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, one comment on your comment. It is not surprising that after adopting a draft mandate on December 21st, the Commission hasn't got yet any reply from the Council. These things take time, but I would expect that this is possible by the end of the year, which is not a bad record if you look at other instances of the same kind. And it's a good thing also that your Minister of Economy comes here and makes his point and listens to what the actual political climate is about relations about Turkey. Now, we've come to the end of this panel. For those tempted to run away, I would say that there is food and drink appearing soon. Our magicians from the event team will transform this whole place in no time at all, and food and drinks will appear. So I invite you to stay on, and I thank our two panelists and the audience for attending. Thank you.